They fed a nation, filled empty stomachs, and then vanished. Forgotten meals from the 18th century that once meant survival now sit buried under modern convenience. What did we lose when we stopped cooking the food that built us? Ash cake was not baked. It was buried. Cornmeal and water mashed into a heavy dough, then shoved straight into the fireplace coals. No skillet, no pot, not even a pan. Just burning ash, raw knead, and the scent of smoke rising off a dirt floor. You could be a runaway, a field worker, or a child living deep in the Appalachian hills. If you had an ash cake, it meant you had something. It was thick, dense, a little gritty, and sometimes still hot in the middle when the outside had already burned. You scraped it clean with your hands, blew off the soot, and chewed like it owes you something. It did. It gave you one more day. This was food born of fire and desperation, but also pride. In slave quarters and settler cabins, they knew how to stretch nothing into enough. It was not about flavor. It was about surviving one more cold night. Somewhere in the memory of our ancestors, there is still the smell of scorched cornmeal and hearthstone. You are what you could, when you could, and sometimes that meant flipping your breakfast on the same blade you used to dig holes. Hoe cakes were survival pancakes, cooked on the flat metal face of a garden hoe, held over an open flame. Cornmeal, salt, and water mixed into a runny batter, then sizzled right there on the tool. It was not sanitary, it was not elegant, but it was warm, and it filled your stomach enough to get back to work. Soldiers made them on campaign trails, sharecroppers made them in the fields, enslaved cooks made them because there was no other choice. If you had a scrap of lard or some bacon grease, you used it. If not, you let the fire do the work. The batter crisped at the edges and burned just a little in the center. When the cake curled up at the sides, it was ready. No syrup, no butter. Just food hot enough to remind you that you were alive. These were not fancy plantation recipes or carefully penned cookbooks. Johnny cake is not the sweet boxed pancake you grew up with. Real Johnny cake was a rough, stone-ground cornmeal flatbread, sometimes thick as a thumb, other times no more than a crisp edge. And the flavor? That came from drippings. Pork grease, bacon fat, or whatever hot animal oil you had from the last meal. It sizzled in a cast iron pan, or a rock if that was all you had, and filled the air with a smell that meant survival. Every hiss of grease was a whisper of comfort in a kitchen where the shelves were almost bare. It was greasy, crumbly, and not always consistent, but that never mattered. When it hit your tongue, it brought a hit of salt, fat, and heat. And when the grease soaked through the bread's edges, it felt almost like luxury. Johnny cakes were for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, anytime the fire was hot and the stomach was louder than the clock. That was the flavor of poverty dressed up as ingenuity. Today, nobody wants to fry in leftover pork fat. We use olive oil, avocado oil, and stovetops with timers. But back then, the real taste of home was whatever was left behind in the pan. Why did we replace memory with convenience and call it progress? Slapjacks were not thick. They were not fluffy. They were flat, barely holding together, made from flour, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt if you were lucky. The name came from the motion. Slap it on the pan, flip it, slap it again. No eggs, no baking powder, just desperation folded into batter. You could fry it in a pan, over a stone, or even on the lid of a kettle. The outside crisped up while the inside stayed doughy. And if you had sorghum syrup, you were eating good. Sorghum was dark, thick, and sticky sweet, made from crushed cane and cooked down in big open kettles. People bartered for it, grew it, and guarded their bottles like gold. One drizzle could turn a tasteless flap of dough into a meal that felt like dessert. Some even traded favors just to get a spoonful. You learned to stretch sweetness, savor each bite, and clean the plate with your fingers. Slapjacks were not Sunday breakfast. They were wartime food. They were poorhouse food. But they were also the food of childhoods that remembered hard times fondly through the smell of syrup on hot iron. This was food with no illusions. Gruel was not supposed to taste good. It was meant to exist. A thin mixture of water and maybe a little grain if the house had any. In most cases, you thickened it with stale bread, hard as stone, or worse, toast burned until black and crumbled into the pot. That was your flavor. That was your texture. Water and ashes. It was the default meal in poorhouses, orphanages, and backwoods infirmaries, handed out in tin cups to people too sick or too broke to ask for more. It steamed just enough to smell like food, even though it barely qualified. You ate it in silence, fast or slow, depending on how bad the hunger was. Every sip was a reminder of what was missing: milk, butter, anything. It filled the stomach, not the soul. Sometimes it was served with pity, sometimes with a prayer. But it always came with the weight of knowing this was all there was. Today, people hear the word gruel and laugh. It is a joke, a metaphor for blandness. Mush was never meant to impress anyone. It was cornmeal boiled into a gluey mass, cooled in a tin or wooden tray until firm, and then sliced into thick rectangles. Those slices were fried the next day. No butter, just lard if you had any, and served with watered-down milk. Sometimes the milk was sour, sometimes it was hot. Most times it was the cheapest way to stretch a meal across 4 mouths. Kids grew up on it. Grandparents remembered it like it was a friend who got them through a long, hard winter. It sat heavy in your stomach, kept you full until the next time someone could scrounge up something better. There was no color, no flair, no garnish. Just pale blocks of corn mush soaking in thin milk. Some families added sugar when they could, or molasses if there was a jar left in the pantry. But often it was just mush and milk and a quiet table. You ate it because it was there. You thanked it, silently, because it was better than hunger. Today, corn mush is a trivia answer, a forgotten relic, but it was once the foundation of 1,000 suppers. Vinegar pie was not invented in a bakery. It came from an empty kitchen, a sour idea that sweetened out of necessity. Lemons were rare, fruits were seasonal, but sugar was sometimes still around, and so was vinegar. The result was something strange and brilliant. The filling was made from sugar, eggs, butter if you had it, and a sharp dash of vinegar to imitate that lemony tang. Poured into a crust and baked until it jiggled like custard, it became a kind of fake lemon pie that somehow felt real. It was tart. It was sweet, and it was an act of culinary defiance. You could be broke, isolated, and grieving, but you could still pull a pie out of the oven and pretend everything was fine. People brought it to funerals, to potlucks, to church halls. It became the desperation dessert that no one talked about, but everyone knew. It was the taste of making do, the flavor of getting by. And even though it came from lack, it left you feeling just a little more whole. This was not baked in an oven. It was boiled, inside a floured cloth in the fireplace kettle for hours. Suette pudding was a thick, starchy lump of flour, breadcrumbs, and fat. The suette, rendered beef or mutton fat, was chopped fine and mixed with whatever scraps you had on hand. If you were lucky, dried currants or raisins. If not, maybe a pinch of spice or a splash of treacle. The result was dense, chewy, and oddly comforting. It was the kind of meal that held together a body that had worked all day. Warm, greasy, and heavy as a stone. You sliced it thick, poured on some syrup if there was any, and called it dinner, or dessert, or both. There was no line between savory and sweet when you were just trying to fill a plate. It steamed in its cloth like a wrapped secret, hidden in bubbling water that darkened as the hours went by. Families used to fight over the crusty edges where the cloth had pressed tight. Today, we would call it primitive, but back then it was nourishment that hugged you from the inside. You could eat it by candlelight and feel like the day had not defeated you. Suette pudding was what you made when you had next to nothing, but still wanted it to feel like a feast. It started with what you were supposed to throw away. The peelings, the ends, the scraps from last night's potato pot. You rinsed them, maybe scrubbed them, maybe not. Then you boiled them, long and slow, with a few onions or wild herbs and a little salt if you had any. That was your soup. No meat, no broth. Just the memory of a potato and the will to survive. Some mothers swore by it, others swore at it. But either way, it fed the family. It tasted earthy. sometimes bitter, sometimes like nothing at all. But it was hot, and that counted for something. The steam fogged up frostbitten windows. The pot never really emptied. You just kept adding to it. Carrot tops, turnip greens, a crust of stale bread. It became something more than soup. It was a living, simmering promise that you would find a way to get through the winter. Today, we peel our potatoes and throw the skins in the trash. We order pre-made stock and toss leftovers out without thinking. It looked like an omelette, but it did not taste like one. This was a cold Tanzy omelette made from beaten eggs and bitter greens, except the greens were Tanzy, an herb known more for its toxicity than its flavor. But when you were out of spinach, out of kale, out of anything green that would stretch a meal, you reached for what grew in the hedgerows. Tanzy grew fast and strong. It smelled like camphor and old medicine, but it was edible in small doses. People believed it had health benefits, cleansing the blood, chasing out worms, but mostly, it just made you feel like you were eating something fresh. The omelet was cooked low and slow, the Tanzy mixed in until the whole thing turned greenish and strange. You ate it cold. Not because it tasted better that way, but because you had to make it ahead, let it sit and ration it out. One slice for each person, maybe two if there were fewer mouths that night. Today, we know Tanzy in large amounts can be dangerous. It is banned in food use in many places. Green pumpkin pie was a clever solution born out of desperation and frugality. When apples became too rare or too expensive, especially in late autumn or early winter, families turned to their gardens and found a substitute: young green pumpkins. These immature gourds had a tangy snap that mimicked tart apples when sliced thin, dusted with cinnamon, and baked into a pie crust. Of course, you had to peel them just right and stew them slowly in sweetened syrup to soften the fibrous texture. The smell filled the house with a sense of false abundance. It felt like biting into normalcy, even if it was made from something that should have gone to livestock. No one talked about how odd it really tasted. They just called it pie and looked at each other across the table with tired smiles. In a way, green pumpkin pie was a lie that everyone agreed to believe. But the lie fed the spirit, and sometimes that mattered more than feeding the stomach. The recipe persisted well into the 1800s, passed down not because it was good, but because it had once been enough. Salt pork and ash broth was the kind of meal that reminded you were still alive, but barely. When supplies were at their lowest and meat was just a rumor, people clung to the last fatty trimmings of salt-cured pork. They would toss the rinds into a pot of boiling water, hoping the salt and fat alone would be enough to turn it into a meal. But the flavor was flat, even after hours of boiling. So someone somewhere, maybe out of accident or necessity, scraped charcoal from the fireplace and added it in. It gave the broth a smoky depth, almost like meat had once been there, just salty fat water with the ghost of smoke. It was not delicious, it was not hearty, it was survival. And when that faint smokiness hit the back of your throat, it felt like breathing in the memory of real food. People did not talk much while eating it. They just swallowed and hoped tomorrow would be better. That kind of hope was often the only thing left in the pot. Leather britches beans were not made for taste. They were made for keeping your family fed deep into winter when nothing green had grown for months. Pole beans, tough, fibrous, and plain, were strung like ornaments on thread and hung in attics, where heat and air slowly turned them into wrinkled, leathery strands. They looked like something forgotten, but they were never truly forgotten. When the time came, you would boil them back to life. And even after hours of simmering, they kept their chew. It was like eating old rope soaked in broth. But that was the point: durability over flavor. Leather britches were a reminder that food was not always meant to be enjoyed, it was meant to endure. Kids would ask why they were called that, and parents would smile and say, "Because they chew like daddy's boots." And they were not joking. These beans held no glamour, but they held people together when the world was falling apart. Molasses water and cornmeal dumplings were as close to dessert as some families ever got. The molasses, thick and dark like tree sap, was stirred into boiling water until it made a sweet, sticky broth. Into that went lumps of plain cornmeal dough, spooned carelessly and dropped like wishes into the bubbling pot. They swelled and softened, absorbing the sugary water until they floated like golden clouds. It smelled better than it tasted. The molasses was heavy and sometimes bitter, especially the cheaper kinds, but it masked the emptiness. No milk, no butter, no eggs, just corn and syrup and water. It was hot and sweet and enough to quiet a child's hunger for a little while. In the worst months, it felt like a treat. Parents would watch their children eat and feel a pang, not from hunger, but from guilt. They wanted to give more, but this was all they had. And in moments like that, molasses water became more than food. It was a lullaby in a bowl, a sugar-coated apology for hard times. Ash-roasted turnips with soot were what happened when even the cooking pot felt like a luxury. The turnips, tough and sharp with a bitter bite, were tossed directly into the fire, not over it, in it. Buried in ash and left to roast, the skins would blister and blacken, sometimes cracking open like burnt parchment. They were pulled from the coals with charred fingers, scraped off with whatever was handy, a spoon, a knife, or a rock. The soot clung to the flesh, impossible to wash off without water, which was often just as scarce. So they ate them anyway, with smoky bitterness still clinging to their hands and tongues. The texture was grainy, the taste like earth and smoke and stubbornness, but it was food, barely. And that made it sacred. There was no seasoning, no plate, no side dish, just a blackened root that reminded you the fire had not won. In the quiet after dinner, the ashes still glowed, and so did the memory of surviving another day. Beer crust bread was born out of scraps, but it rose like a miracle. In homes where beer was brewed in wooden barrels and open tubs, there was always leftover froth and sediment. Yeast-heavy and bubbling with wild bacteria, this sludgy remnant was mixed with flour, salt, and nothing else. No proper yeast, no milk. Just the dregs of yesterday's beer and the flour from today's last scoop. The result was dense, sour, and uneven, but it held together. It held people together. The crust was thick and rough, almost burned in spots, but the smell of fermentation filled the kitchen with something close to comfort. The bread tore rather than sliced, and often had bitter pockets where the beer had settled too long. But every bite was earned. There was no waste. Not from the beer, not from the flour, not from the effort. People learned to love it because they had no choice. And over time, it became more than bread. It became proof that you could build something out of almost nothing, as long as you had patience and a little leftover brew. Cowheel jelly was not food. It was a dare, a test, and a tradition all rolled into one. You boiled cow feet, yes, feet, until the skin, cartilage, and tendons melted into a gelatinous broth. It simmered for hours, then sat overnight to solidify into something cold, wobbly, and translucent. No spice, no sugar, just salt and boiled essence. Served cold in thick slabs, it was eaten without expression. Supposedly, it gave you strength. That is what the old folks said, and in a way it did, if you could keep it down. The texture was slippery and stubborn, clinging to your spoon like it knew you were afraid. But it filled the belly and kept for days without spoiling. In the days before refrigerators, that alone made it priceless. Children dreaded it. Elders respected it. Everyone else tolerated it. Cowheel jelly was not made to delight. It was made to remind. Remind you of what animals gave. Remind you that waste was not an option. And remind you that survival was often more gruesome than glorious. Indian pudding was once the highlight of a tavern table, steaming hot and slow-cooked for hours. But by the time the hard years rolled around, it was what you made when there was nothing else left. Cornmeal, molasses, and water, sometimes a splash of milk if you were lucky, were stirred into a pot and baked low and slow until it thickened into a dark, sticky mass. The name had long roots, but by the time of the Depression and the hard winters before it, it was just another way to make something from nothing. The molasses gave it depth, The cornmeal gave it weight, and the thyme gave it texture. Some added spice if they had it. Most did not. It was never sweet enough to be dessert and never rich enough to be dinner. But it was warm, and that mattered. In a cold house with bare shelves, Indian pudding was comfort carved out of crumbs. Chestnut mash cakes were born from the woods, not the fields. When wheat failed or corn ran out, people turned to the trees. Wild chestnuts, back when they were still everywhere, were gathered by the basket and boiled down until the bitter skins slipped away. The meat inside was starchy and dense, like dry mashed potatoes. People would mash it finer, shape it into patties, and fry them in animal fat when they had it. The outside crisped, the inside stayed soft, and if you closed your eyes, it almost felt like something better. It did not rise. It did not hold butter. But it did not need to. Chestnut cakes were never glamorous, but they were grounding. The kind of food you could feel in your jaw and your chest long after the meal. Sometimes they were eaten with honey. Sometimes just as they were, hot and steaming on a bare plate. They filled the gap that bread left behind. And in doing so, they reminded people that nature still provided, even if you had to fight a squirrel for it. Cabbage core stew was the last stop before hunger. The outer cabbage leaves, thick and green, were stripped away and tossed to livestock. What remained, the pale, tough core, was all that was left for the table. It was chopped, boiled, and boiled again, softened into a bitter broth that curled the nose. Vinegar helped, barely. Maybe a spoon of lard if you had it. The result was a thin, sour stew that looked like it should have been thrown out, and often had been in better years. But this was not a time for pride. It was a time for boiling what no one else wanted and calling it dinner. Children hated it. Parents apologized with their eyes. But everyone ate it, because behind that bowl of scraps was a truth no one said out loud. There was nothing else. And somehow, even that truth had to taste like home. Apple peel. Vinegar soup was never meant to be a luxury, yet during times of scarcity, it became a staple for those who had learned the art of making something from nothing. Apple peels, often tossed aside after the fruit was gone, found a second life when soaked in vinegar, boiled with onions, and seasoned to create a tangy broth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fill the belly, even if the heart wasn't satisfied. In a world where food was an expensive commodity, everything, absolutely everything, was used. The rich, sour taste of the vinegar clung to the air as the soup simmered, a reminder that survival came at the cost of flavor. There were no second chances. Only what was in your hands, or what could be made from what you once discarded. It wasn't a meal to savor, but to endure. It was a humble act of defiance against hunger, showing how far people would go to stretch their resources, no matter how bitter the taste. Rabbit skin cracklings were never the centerpiece of the table, but they kept people alive when the cupboards turned hollow. After skinning rabbits for meat, nothing went to waste, not even the scraps clinging to the hide. People would scrape the skins, cut them into slivers, and fry them in lard until they crisped. What you got were chewy, sinewy cracklings, salty, rich, and just enough to fool your stomach into silence. There was no glamour in it, no elegance, just survival dressed in grease. These were bites born of necessity, crafted in kitchens where there was no room for pride. Children used to chew them like jerky, not for fun, but because it beat hunger. And for some, it was the closest thing to meat they would taste that week. In the winter months, when rabbits were caught more out of desperation than sport, these cracklings became both meal and memory. You could smell them frying long before you saw them, and by then, someone had already claimed the biggest piece. Now, the very idea of it unsettles us. Slaughterhouse porridge was a dish you found outside butcher shops or wherever the offcuts of the animal world were left behind, abandoned by those who could afford something more refined. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't pretty, but to those who had no choice, it was a free ticket to fullness. Grain boiled in the bones and offal left behind in the slaughterhouse became a hearty, if unsightly, porridge. The meat scraps, often discarded by butchers, found their way into pots, where they lent their richness to the broth, transforming it into something barely edible, unless you were hungry enough. The smell of it, of boiled blood and fat, lingered for hours after the meal had been eaten. For many, this was a reality of survival, and the porridge wasn't an option, it was a way of life. The scraps were given away, traded, or simply collected by those who had nothing to offer but an empty belly. Whey and rye pudding was born out of desperation, but became a comfort in kitchens where the scent of milk had long since disappeared. After cheese was made, the leftover whey was often discarded, but for those struggling to fill their bellies, it became something precious. Mixed with dark rye flour, it transformed into a thick, hearty pudding. Sweetened just enough with whatever was available, this humble dish was a quiet victory in a world of scarcity. Rye, dense and rich in nutrients, replaced wheat and became the unsung hero of so many households. The pudding wasn't rich in flavor, but it was rich in sustenance. Served hot, it was a bowl of warmth and texture, sometimes flavored with whatever dried fruit could be found, but always eaten with a sense of something that would be gone too soon. People ate it not out of choice, but out of necessity, yet it brought a certain comfort, a brief respite from the cold, cruel world. Cattail root hash was a meal for those who had learned to forage before they ever knew how to farm. In marshy areas, where food was scarce and the land offered little else, cattails grew as a silent promise of sustenance. The roots were boiled and mashed, transformed into a starchy paste, and then fried into a makeshift hash that could stretch a meal through the day. There was nothing glamorous about cattail root hash. It was gritty, earthy, and often served with a side of regret for those who could remember the days when their meals had been plentiful. But for some, this was more than survival. It was ingenuity. A food born of necessity, yes, but also a testament to human resilience. People dug up the roots, worked them into something edible, and carried on, not because it was easy, but because they had no choice. It was hard, exhausting work that often left you with little to show but full stomachs and empty hands. How many people today would have the courage to rely on such humble, wild food? Chinkapin cakes were a bittersweet reminder of a time when the land offered what it could, and settlers had to make do with what they could find. Chinkapins, small chestnut-like nuts, were gathered from the woods, boiled and mashed into a paste. They were then shaped into cakes, fried and eaten in place of bread or other grains that had grown scarce. The cakes were hearty and filling, but they also symbolized a time of hardship and adaptation. For the early Appalachian settlers, food often came from the land, and if they wanted to eat, they had to be resourceful. The land may have been wild, but it was also generous if you knew how to read its signs. People ate these cakes not because they were a delicacy, but because they kept hunger at bay. When corn or wheat were unavailable, this simple substitute brought some small semblance of comfort. Yet, as time passed, these cakes faded from memory. How easily we forget the taste of a world once balanced between survival and scarcity, and how little it took to satisfy a hunger we can no longer imagine. Bread crust coffee substitute was born out of necessity during the times when coffee beans were too expensive for the average person to afford. What could have been a luxury became a forgotten tradition in favor of a bitter, burnt substitute. Leftover bread crusts, often the hardest and most ignored parts of a loaf, were charred and boiled to create a coffee-like drink for those who couldn't afford the real thing. The crusts were dunked into boiling water, creating a dark, bitter brew that tasted nothing like the rich, robust coffee many dreamt of. But at least it provided some semblance of warmth and caffeine. The bitter taste lingered on the tongue, a stark reminder of what was no longer available and what had to be done to survive. This strange brew was born not from desire, but out of the need to get by. It was a coffee substitute in every sense of the word, yet it became more than that. It was a ritual of survival, something to look forward to on the cold mornings when little else could be counted on. Corn cob broth is one of the most unlikely meals in history. Yet, during the hardest times, it was a testament to how far necessity can stretch the imagination. People would boil corn cobs after the kernels had been harvested, simmering them for hours to extract the last bit of flavor. It wasn't a luxurious broth. It wasn't even a decent one. But in desperate times, when the pantry was empty and hope was running low, this was the depth of the flavor people could afford. The broth, which was little more than water and the essence of corn, was thickened with whatever they had: flour, oats, or even a handful of herbs. The smell was simple but comforting, reminding them of better days when food wasn't a constant struggle. Yet, this humble concoction was enough to fill the stomach and give enough energy to continue, even if it didn't nourish the soul. The memory of corn cob broth, now lost to time, raises a difficult question. Wild onion and dandelion salad was the kind of dish you only ate when there was nothing left to eat. The bitter greens of wild onions and dandelions were gathered in the spring when fresh produce was a luxury, tossed with a little rendered lard or bacon grease in place of the rich dressings most of us take for granted today. There was no sweetness here, no richness to comfort the palate, just bitterness, a sharp reminder of what could be found in the wild if you knew where to look. It wasn't a salad that would ever win a prize at a banquet, but it was a meal for those who had no other choice, eaten by people who knew that survival often required swallowing more than just food. It required resilience. A simple, wild salad, made from the earth itself, was sometimes all that could be had. And yet, it became part of the rhythm of life during lean years, eaten not because it tasted good, but because it was necessary. Tallow biscuits were a hard reminder of how much the world has changed. Made with beef fat instead of butter, they were grayish in color, dense, and carried a meaty flavor that most people today would struggle to appreciate. When butter was a luxury too expensive to afford, beef fat became the go-to substitute. These biscuits were not flaky or soft. Instead, they were firm and filling, designed to hold up under the weight of hunger, not to tempt the palate. People ate them because they had to, not because they wanted to. But for those who ate them, these tallow biscuits were sustenance, a momentary escape from the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. They were often paired with whatever was available: soup, gravy, or sometimes just a little salt. Now we would turn our noses up at the thought of them. But once, these humble biscuits were the bridge between survival and starvation. They were eaten with no complaint and no choice. Potted meat spread. The 1930s tin can be savior. You're absolutely right if you're imagining mystery meat mashed into a paste. However, let's face it, that little tin of potted meat was the hero of many Depression-era meals. This questionable concoction was spread on crackers or smeared between slices of stale bread and kept families fed when other protein sources were out of reach. Potted meat spread was made from finely ground scraps of pork or beef, seasoned with salt, spices, and sometimes gelatin, and had a long shelf life and a low price tag. Others got creative, adding it to onions or pickles to add some flavor. Some were not so lucky and ate it straight from the can. And let's not forget the genius marketing. Even if potted meat wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, it was often marketed as the ultimate protein-packed snack for families on the go. During a time when home-cooked meals were often replaced by anything that could be prepared quickly, it was cheap, filling, and in its own way, a miracle worker. Was it delicious? Probably not. It was practical, portable, and didn't need cooking. A major bonus when every penny counted. Potted meat spread still lives on, in grocery aisles as a throwback to those hard times. You won't see it on the center of a modern charcuterie board, but it's a reminder of survival, ingenuity, and the pure will to make something edible out of almost nothing. Preserved foods are time-tested essentials, expertly crafted to outlast the seasons and keep hunger at bay no matter the circumstances. Salted meat. The original meat preservation hack before freezers were even a dream. Whether it was jerky, salted fish, or cured pork, this method was a game changer for survival because salt is basically nature's food kryptonite. It stops bacteria in their tracks, keeping meat edible for weeks, months, or even years. For our ancestors, this meant protein on demand. No spoilage, no waste, just salty goodness. Salt was so valuable in ancient times it was literally used as currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salarium, or salt money. Yep, that's where the word salary comes from. And they weren't just munching on jerky for kicks. Salted meat kept armies marching, sailors sailing, and explorers exploring. It was essential for long journeys when fresh food was impossible to keep. Without it, forget discovering new continents. Most ships wouldn't have made it past week 2. Jerky, dried to chewy perfection, came from indigenous peoples of the Americas, who used the sun, smoke, and salt to preserve meat. Meanwhile, salted cod became the fish that fed the world, fueling trade routes and diets from Europe to the Caribbean. Long-lasting, portable, and packed with protein, it kept people alive and moving. What they don't tell you about Hawaii is that, as much as it is a tropical wonderland, it's also a melting pot of Asian and American culture. That's how we ended up with Spam Musubi after all, a dish that probably represents the cultural blend of cuisines you can find in Hawaii better than anything else. It's something that goes all the way back to the Second World War. That was when Spam was first popularly introduced to the American people, and by the 40s and 50s, it had become a staple of the daily Hawaiian diet. By the 70s, it was something that firmly became a part of the local food scene there. Spam was something that was as available as air, or so it seemed for a long time, and it was stupidly cheap too. A can would net you a grand total loss of $50. The dish itself was this wondrous harmony of American convenience brought to its best form by Japanese flavor and tradition. Musubi means to bind in Japanese, and it involves making a compact shape out of rice by pressing it and then putting a slice of fried Spam on the top. Then you take some nori, which is just seaweed, and wrap it in a strip. This was a handheld treat, but it was something that had a lot of personalization and attention to detail put into it, so it almost became like a fun hobby for the locals. Plus, this was something that bounced off well with Filipino culture as well, which was very dominant in Hawaii at the time. Spam Musubi was something that got popular enough to be in local grocery stores anywhere around Hawaii. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Suette, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Suette was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Suette was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months, when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suette wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like Suette pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, Suette was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suette has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in lard's clothing. So the next thing on our list is baked turnips and cream sauces, but dear viewer, I know you aren't 5, and I know you're curious about how cream sauces could even be a thing in a time like this. After all, if people were struggling to get enough milk and eggs, where on God's green earth were they finding the money to get cream for? You see, my friend, there was a stark difference in lifestyles between two types of people: those that grew up in the city and those that grew up in the countryside. Now, for the people trapped in those urban jungles during the Dust Bowl, I completely agree with you. Where did they get their cream from? For the ones living in rural shanty towns, though, well, you gotta know that they came from a long tradition of farming, a tradition that by the 1930s was still relatively upheld by most families. This meant that lots of these farming households had their own cattle and cows, and that's how they would get their milk and cream. Baked turnips, on the other hand, were something that was more commonly seen in the cities. It was, after all, something that primarily required an oven. In rural areas, it was a lot more common for people to pass the time with boiled turnips instead, but sometimes people would get a bag of popcorn during the Depression cost as little as 5 cents. That meant that for around 20, you could be getting a family bucket worth of popcorn. This was an accessible and easy treat for all kinds of people, and that's a big part of why it was such a beloved snack throughout the Depression. It rose to be one of the highlights of the era because it was one of the few comforts that stayed untouched by the economic circumstances that were drowning everyone. While popcorn's never overstayed its welcome and always been a big part of American culture, its place as a Depression-era snack is special. This truly was one of the best things you could buy back then. Plain and buttered popcorn was pretty much the everyday norm for people during the Depression, and it was a really good snack that Americans indulged in frequently. More than that, it showed people's resilience too. Popcorn was something that people treated as a side effect of hanging out with your friends. You'd go to the movies, and by the law of, well, normalcy, you'd just end up getting popcorn. To make that into a dish that would be sustenance and still bring a smile to everyone's face showcased the spirit of the American people who were determined to outlast the Depression, as hard and tiring as that was. While there weren't any movie theaters to go to, since that was a luxury people couldn't afford anymore, people did find all kinds of new love and appreciation for popcorn. What goes best with popcorn is a drink, and that goes for our list too. Plus, I did say that the next thing we'd talk about would be beverages. But honestly, beans don't really do much for me. If you're like that, maybe you'd be more interested in a real meal like grilled cheese sandwiches. Okay, I'm just kidding. Mostly. For real though, grilled cheese sandwiches are arguably the most iconic, quintessential American comfort food we will ever come across. Many Americans tried to get by on affordable and simple staple options, grilled cheese sandwiches being one of the easiest ones. All you had to do was take some good old American cheese and get your stove started. This was for the longest time the lunch for many people working their day away in offices or college students just trying to get by in their dorms. If you didn't have a lot of money, then Wendy's and KFC for dinner were out of the options. Meals like this still managed to offer some kind of solace to people, and to be honest, a grilled cheese sandwich could cheer up most people's day, wouldn't you agree? One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. Naturally long-lasting foods are nature's built-in survival kit, offering sustenance and durability straight from the source. Root vegetables, those humble, earthy powerhouses that have been keeping people fed for centuries. Potatoes, carrots, turnips. These are the veggies that survived harsh winters, poor soil, and even the occasional hungry bear. They might not have the glamour of leafy greens, but they've got something better: staying power. Did you know that the potato was first domesticated by the Andean people around 8,000 years ago? Fast forward to the 16th century, and they were the food that saved Europe during famines. Potatoes helped Europe avoid starvation, and they didn't even need a passport to do it. Meanwhile, in America, the potato became the crop that fueled the westward expansion. So yeah, potatoes kind of built the country. Did you know carrots weren't always orange? Originally, they came in purple, white, and yellow. The modern orange carrot was developed in the Netherlands in the 17th century as a tribute to the royal house of Orange. And let's not forget turnips. These underrated root veggies have been a staple for centuries, especially during times of war and scarcity. They're tough, they're hardy, and they can survive in the coldest of conditions. And to be honest, how could things like cup noodles not get old? I mean, the 20th century was special, man. We came up with all kinds of genuinely amazing dishes, and nifty, tricky ones for tough times, like cabbage soup. This was something that people really started to warm up to during the Depression because back then, the popular thing to do was to grow your own produce. No, really. People had a green thumb back then. They were called victory gardens. And the idea was to basically repurpose your own backyard and make it into a little plot you could farm on. One of the easiest things to grow at the time were cabbages. How does all this relate to being broke in the 80s? Well, the thing about the 20th century is that money problems were a big trademark of the entire century. The effects of the combined trifecta of disaster that was the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and both of the world wars left America, its people, and their wallets scarred for an immeasurable amount of time. People couldn't really let go of all the hacks, tricks, and ways of survival they came up with in times like those, especially as they struggled to grapple with the after effects. Cabbage soup was one of the most popular meals to make for working-class families because for 25 to 35 cents, you could feed your family a nutritious meal that could be added to in several different ways. Not a bad deal, right? Pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days. But during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, a pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. Fondue set meals were symptomatic of a larger phenomena that was enveloping all of America as the years kept coming and did not stop coming. This was basically the national full-blown craze we had with exploring other cuisines, other cultures, and other ways of preparing food. Fondue was something that came entirely out of the Book of Switzerland. Swiss culinary tradition has had fondue as a major player for years now. It was something that came to American diners during the tail end of the 50s when fascination with European dining, sophistication in cuisine was increasing more and more. Fondue became a trend far later too, in the 70s and 80s, but it was the first time that something the rich would usually play with and have in their homes as a display was something that was not only an interest of the middle class, but also an incredibly affordable option. Now, you had fondue set meals, which were pretty pricey if I'm being completely honest with you. They were going from anywhere between $8 to $15, which if you adjusted that for inflation would run you around $80 to $150 today. I don't know what's more disappointing, that they cost that much back then or that inflation is this bad now. It was kind of worth it though, because if you did have a fondue set, everyone wanted to throw a party at your place. Plus, they made one hell of a wedding gift. Walk the streets of Texas, New Mexico, or Oklahoma for a while in the 90s, and you'll soon find an abundance of Tex-Mex food, such as Frito pies. These pies were for people who were into all things savory. Really, on a budget, you could have a pie crust full of chili, cheese, and some corn chips, and it was a fun way of repurposing these cheap and bare-bones ingredients into something filling, something that could accommodate an entire household. The Frito-Lay company had also been pushing their chips as hard as they could. They wanted to make you believe that there was nothing cheaper than a pack of Fritos, and that really was true for the most part. By the 90s at least, Frito chips barely cost a few cents, and canned chili wasn't even $1. Frito chips were something so intrinsically tied to the childhood routine of so many kids that it's a wonder this thing ever went out of relevancy. Frito pies used to be something that you could find at concession stands at your local football match, school cafeterias, and even diners on the side of the road. People would actually make it right in the chip bag, funnily enough, but hey, the Hispanic community is full of wonderful dishes we've forgotten about. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had, or didn't have, when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying, given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. Hardtac, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtac was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtac was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtac is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. If the idea of cowbrain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cowbrains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cowbrain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cowbrain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cowbrain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cowbrain stew faded into the background, becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cowbrain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. Swiss chard is a leafy green we don't hear too much about anymore, and that was the case back then too. I don't blame people, since its glory days were definitely before the 20th century. But people remembered this little green once again during the Dust Bowl. People would pair this up with white bean soup, which was something that the masses found it very hard to live without. Why? They were a fabulous source of protein, they are affordable, you could even forage them, and these could actually be stored for months. This was a time where people were desperate for protein, by the way. A lot of good cuts of meat were more expensive than ever, and just out of the reach of most common people, while a lot of other kinds of things like nuts and almonds just weren't filling you up enough for the amount of money or time it would take to get enough of them. You had to be really smart with every cent, so people would go for things like white bean soup with Swiss chard. This was a versatile combination that had every pro health-wise on top of being something that could feed the entire family and be made with minimal effort. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners. Honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener. It was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. So we're going to go up to the upper-class side of things for a bit. This wasn't a dish that anyone else could have afforded to make or eat back then anyway. Homemade noki with noodles was still something that the relatively well-off and affluent families in the States were able to eat, and it was entirely something limited to certain parts of big urban hubs like Chicago, New York, and Washington. Noki is an Italian dish, which I'm sure you already know. What's interesting is that it actually came on over to the States thanks to Italian immigrants, and back then, it hadn't become the fine dining appetizer that it's known to be today. It wasn't exactly that pricey either. Back then, Italian communities full of immigrants were still making it whenever they could. For the noki, all you would need is flour, water, and dough. These were things that were out of the reach of normal people, sure, but to people with generational wealth? Well, it was mostly business as usual. Don't get me wrong, even though they were impacted by the recession and the Dust Bowl, there wasn't a single American home that wasn't. Did they draw the short end of the stick, though? Not by a long shot. This wasn't a dish you'd see anywhere outside of real bougie neighborhoods. If you ever wanted to see something that was an honest testament to our potential for culinary creativity during economically stressful times, you need only look at poor man's lasagna, a beloved classic that comes with ingredients you can get from anywhere. This helped families keep themselves afloat while also giving them familiar tastes that they couldn't really have anymore. Like I said, living on a budget is something that you really just can't ever step out of. That also means that a lot of what we call culture and tradition, such as our foods, recipes, ways of life, and hobbies, all of that may become pretty inaccessible or outright impossible. It might just be too expensive, you know? So here, instead of expensive lasagna noodles, most homes use these really raggedy, broken strands of spaghetti or egg noodles, and these would basically be just for a few cents. The cheeses and sauce were also really limited. Normally, you see loads of cheeses with lasagna, but this time around, there was only one or two in a jar of tomato sauce that pretty much was the only thing you could go for when it came to a base. To help bulk the dish, people would often throw in mushrooms, vegetables, or even some layers of bread. It was an attempt at a lasagna, and it often came pretty close, or at least close enough that no one cared about the difference. If these forgotten meals made you rethink what it means to truly survive, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe.